The sun was slowly setting over Red Willow Creek, Texas, spreading a weary, golden light over the town, too small to hide secrets and too silent to forget them. Shadows stretched across the cracked sidewalks, touching the old facades of shops that had survived decades of broken promises and unfinished dreams. The wind blew dry, raising reddish dust and dead leaves, as if the earth itself were breathing with difficulty. It was the kind of sunset that seemed beautiful from a distance, but carried an invisible weight for those who knew how to look beyond the surface. At the end of the main street, near a commercial building that had been closed for years, stood a man who didn't seem to fit into that tranquil setting. His name was Lucas Harrington, a war veteran. Not just someone who served, but a veteran of wars in the rawest sense of the word. One of those who return home but never come back whole. He remained motionless, leaning against the worn brick wall, as if he were part of the building. As if he had been there for a long time, waiting for something he himself couldn't define. Lucas held a crumpled envelope with controlled firmness. Inside were simple resumes, printed on cheap paper, folded and unfolded so many times they seemed as tired as the man carrying them. His dark jacket, bought second-hand at a roadside shop, was loose at the shoulders, but still couldn't hide his rigid, trained, almost automatic posture. It was the posture of a war veteran who had learned on the battlefield that relaxing too much can cost you your life. Lucas's face was marked by time, not by age, but by experiences. There were deep lines around his eyes, not from frequent smiles, but from sleepless nights. His gaze, too attentive for such a calm place, scanned the street as if mapping escape routes, assessing every movement, every sound. Even there, in Red Willow Creek, far from any combat zone, the war veteran couldn't allow himself distractions. The war had taught him that danger doesn't announce its arrival. The distant bell of the local church struck 6 o'clock in the afternoon. The sound echoed through the nearly empty street, reverberating between the low buildings. For the residents, it was just another sign of the end of the day. For Lucas, the sound pierced something deeper. His body reacted before his mind. A slight tensing of muscles, a breath held for fractions of a second. Years ago, sudden sounds meant orders, attacks, losses. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, counting mentally, as he had learned in rehabilitation sessions that never seemed enough for a war veteran like him. Around them, the city continued at its slow pace. An old car passed slowly, its engine sputtering slightly. A couple crossed the street, conversing in hushed voices. On a distant balcony, someone swayed in a wooden chair, watching the world go by. No one seemed to notice Lucas Harrington. And in a way, that was exactly how he had learned to exist since returning from the war. Invisible, silent, displaced. A war veteran lost in a place that no longer knew how to receive him. There was something heavy in the air that afternoon. An undefined feeling of anticipation, as if Red Willow Creek were holding its breath, awaiting an event that didn't yet have a name. Lucas felt it deep in his chest, a familiar pressure similar to that which preceded important missions. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that this day wouldn't end like all the others, that this simple act of looking for a job, of trying to survive another week, could turn into something much bigger. He adjusted the envelope in his hands, feeling the rough paper under his fingers. It was strange how such simple gestures still required effort. The war had taken much from Lucas Harrington, but what hurt most was the constant feeling of being out of place. He was a war veteran in a city that valued simple stories, happy endings, and predictable routines, and Lucas knew, better than anyone, that his life didn't fit into any of those categories. The sky was slowly darkening, and the first streetlights flickered on before becoming steady. The shadows grew thicker, and the main street seemed narrower. Lucas straightened up, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The sound of his boots echoed on the ground like a silent reminder that, even trying to start over, he would never stop being who he was. He was Lucas Harrington, a war veteran, and at that moment, without knowing it, she was about to enter the most decisive chapter of her life. The life of Lucas Harrington, a war veteran. He followed a rhythm that wasn't exactly a rhythm, but a succession of days too similar to be called routine and too burdensome to be ignored. In Red Willow Creek, Texas mornings started early for almost everyone, but for Lucas, they never seemed to truly begin. He woke before the sun, always before the cheap alarm clock vibrated on his bedside table. Sleep came in short fragments, interrupted by memories that didn't ask permission to return. When he opened his eyes, it took him a few seconds to recognize the low ceiling of the small rented room above an old mechanic's workshop. Only then did he take a deep breath, reminding himself where he was. At home, if that place could even be called that. The room was simple, almost empty. A narrow bed, a rusty metal wardrobe, a small table with a chair that creaked at the slightest movement. There were no photographs, no personal belongings beyond the essentials. Lucas had learned over the years that the fewer things that surrounded him, the fewer memories he had to hide. Still, the war found its place. It always did. Because being a war veteran wasn't something you left outside when you closed the door. He stood up slowly, his knees silently complaining. Some aches and pains never completely disappeared. They were physical reminders of distant places, of uneven terrain, of nights spent in uncomfortable positions, always ready to react. In the cracked mirror of the shared bathroom, Lucas saw a man who looked older than he actually was. His gaze carried an old weariness, a weight that didn't come from work, but from its absence. A war veteran trying to fit into a world that had moved on without waiting for him. After washing his face with cold water, he put on the same simple clothes as always. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Lucas didn't like being watched. In Red Willow Creek, that was almost impossible. Small towns notice everything, even when they pretend not to. The neighbors knew little about him, and perhaps that was exactly what caused distrust. A lonely, reserved man who didn't talk about his past. A war veteran who preferred silence to explanations. He descended the creaking wooden stairs and stepped out onto the still, half-empty street. The morning air was dry, heavy with the smell of earth and fuel. Lucas walked to a small cafe near the state highway, where he bought the cheapest coffee on the menu. Always the same order, always in cash. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a curious look, already knew his name but never called him. There was respect in that distance, or perhaps just caution. Lucas always sat at the same table, with his back to the wall, with a clear view of the door and windows. It was a habit he couldn't break, a direct reflection of years living as a war veteran in environments where sitting in the wrong place could mean not going home. Even there, between cups of coffee and banal conversations about the weather, he remained alert. He observed everything, the tone of voices, the abrupt movements, the departures. After coffee, the hardest part of the day began. The job search. Lucas walked through the city with his envelope of resumes under his arm, going into shops, workshops, warehouses. He repeated the same simple, direct speech. He was looking for any opportunity. He didn't mention the war. He didn't talk about being a war veteran. He had learned that, for many, this generated more discomfort than empathy. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. Few really listened. The answers were almost always the same. "We'll call. We're not hiring right now. Leave your contact information." Lucas would thank them, maintain a respectful posture, and move on. He never argued. He never insisted. Part of him already expected rejection before even walking through the door. It was as if the civilian world had unwritten rules that he hadn't learned to follow. Rules that didn't exist on the battlefield, where everything was brutally clear. In the afternoon, when the sun beat down on the asphalt and the city seemed to slow down even more, Lucas used to walk to the bank of the small river that cut through Red Willow Creek. There, sitting on a worn wooden bench, he watched the water slowly flow by. The sound helped calm his mind. Sometimes he would close his eyes and let the wind brush against his face. It was one of the few moments when I could feel something close to peace. Still, never completely. Because being a war veteran meant living with a past that never truly faded. The residents saw him as someone distant. Few knew that Lucas discreetly helped whenever he could. He fixed broken fences, carried groceries for the elderly, did small repairs in exchange for almost nothing. He never asked for recognition. He never stayed long enough to talk. It was the way he had found to continue serving, even out of uniform. A war veteran still trying to be useful in a world that didn't quite know what to do with him. At night, back in his room, the silence grew heavier. Lucas heated up a simple meal, sat at the table, and ate slowly. He didn't turn on the television. The sound bothered him. I would prefer to hear the wind outside, the distant creak of a door, the occasional sound of a passing car. Before going to sleep, he would sit on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, breathing deeply, preparing his mind for yet another invisible battle. Rest. Being a war veteran in Red Willow Creek meant living between two worlds, one that kept moving forward, oblivious to the scars that didn't show, and another that remained frozen in time, trapped by memories that insisted on surviving. Lucas Harrington carried on as best he could, day after day, unaware that this silent, almost invisible life was about to be interrupted by an event that would change everything. Long before he became known in Red Willow Creek, Texas, like a quiet and reserved man, Lucas Harrington, he was just an ordinary boy, raised in a simple home, surrounded by values that seemed as solid as the dry land of the countryside. Before becoming a war veteran, before carrying in his eyes the weight of distant places and irreversible decisions, Lucas knew a more predictable world, where the future still seemed like something that could be chosen. He had grown up in a small rural community, not far from there, in a light-colored wooden house that creaked when the wind blew stronger. His father, Robert Harrington, he worked long hours as a mechanic, a man of few words and hands always marked with grease. His mother, Elaine Harrington. She was the kind of woman who kept the house running even when everything seemed to be falling apart. She believed in discipline, honesty, and the almost sacred idea that character was something built every day. These values shaped Lucas long before any military training. As a child, Lucas spent hours outdoors. He ran through open fields, fished in shallow streams, and learned to respect the silence of nature. There was something about him, from an early age, that felt comfortable in stillness. It wasn't shyness, but observation. He liked to understand his surroundings, to notice details that others ignored. Without knowing it, he already carried traits that would later define his destiny as a war veteran. At school, he was never the most popular nor the most problematic. He was the student who sat in the middle of the classroom, did what needed to be done, and rarely drew attention. Teachers said he had potential, but Lucas didn't know exactly what for. The future seemed distant, abstract. The only certainty was the feeling that he needed to be useful, that his life needed to serve something greater than himself. This idea had been planted at home, in simple conversations at the dinner table, when his father spoke about responsibility and his mother about dignity. Adolescence brought questions. Lucas saw his peers dreaming of universities, careers, big cities. He, however, felt an emptiness difficult to explain. There was a silent calling, a constant restlessness. He didn't want to run away from home, nor prove anything to anyone. He wanted to belong. He wanted to be part of something structured, where the rules were clear and the purpose unquestionable. When terrorist attacks began to dominate the news and the country entered a climate of tension and patriotism, Lucas felt something align within him. The decision to enlist wasn't impulsive, but it wasn't entirely rational either. It was a mixture of duty, idealism, and the genuine belief that I could make a difference. When he told his family, silence filled the room. Elaine tried to hide her fear behind a restrained smile. Robert simply nodded, as if he already knew that this path was inevitable. There were no dramatic speeches, just long hugs and the tacit understanding that life, from then on, would be divided into before and after. Military training was a reality check. Lucas quickly discovered that physical strength was only part of what was required. The real transformation happened in his mind. He learned to obey without question, to trust strangers as if they were brothers, to endure limits he never imagined he could reach. Each day distanced him a little further from the boy he once was. Each week molded him into something new. A soldier, a future war veteran, still unaware of the exact price this would exact. Despite the hardship, Lucas found in military service something he had always sought: structure, clarity, a sense of belonging. The friendships formed there were intense, almost immediate. Men and women of different backgrounds, united by the same uniform and the same promise of mutual protection. For the first time, he felt he didn't need to explain who he was. He simply had to fulfill his duty. He simply had to be present. Before the first deployment to the conflict zone, there were quick and restrained farewells. Lucas returned home for only a few days. He walked through the same places from his childhood, now with a different perspective. Everything seemed smaller, more fragile. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how much he had to lose. On his last night, sitting on the porch with his father, he heard few words but enough to mark his memory. Robert simply said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Lucas kept this as an internal code. When he left, he believed he would return the same, only more experienced. He didn't imagine that war isn't limited to the battlefield. He didn't know that, by crossing certain borders, he would leave parts of himself behind. At that moment, however, he was still driven by hope, by an almost naive sense of mission. He wasn't yet a war veteran. He was just a young man believing that serving his country was the most honorable path he could choose. This version of Lucas Harrington, full of expectations and convictions, would remain forever frozen in time. Because the man who would return years later would carry with him not only stories, but invisible scars that would redefine everything he thought he knew about himself, about the world, and about the true cost of war. The war did not reach the life of Lucas Harrington like a single, definitive explosion. It seeped in little by little, silent at first, almost imperceptible until it became omnipresent. When he finally set foot on foreign soil, the heat was different, the air seemed heavier, and the sky had a color that didn't match any memory he had brought from home. There, he ceased to be just a soldier in training and began, without realizing it, the long process of becoming a war veteran, scarred inside. The first few days were a tense adjustment period. Lucas quickly learned that time worked differently on the battlefield. Hours could drag on like days, and seconds could determine who would return alive. Silence was never comfortable. It meant expectation, threat, something about to happen. The war veteran that Lucas would become began to take shape there, amidst long patrols, sleepless nights, and a constant vigilance that slowly corroded his mind. He remembered the weight of the equipment on his body, the sweat trickling down his vest, the constant feeling of being watched. Every corner, every door, every shadow demanded his full attention. The war taught Lucas that trusting his surroundings too much was a fatal mistake. The landscape, however static it seemed, could transform into chaos in an instant. This realization would never leave him. Not even years later, when he was officially called a war veteran. The most difficult memories didn't come in order. They surfaced in fragments, disconnected pieces that blended with the present day. The distant sound of an engine could suddenly transport him back to a dusty road, where a train moved slowly, and the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Lucas remembered the tightness in his chest, the radio communication, the hands too firmly gripping the weapon. There was no heroism in that moment, only survival. There were faces that never left him, comrades who shared hurried meals, nervous jokes, and promises to return home. One of them, in particular, frequently appeared in his thoughts. A man who smiled easily, who spoke of his young daughter as if she were a talisman against the surrounding horror. Lucas remembered his voice, clear and confident, moments before a mission that should never have been different from so many others. Then, silence, a heavy, definitive silence. The war didn't explain it. It never does. It was on that day that something broke inside Lucas Harrington. He kept functioning, kept following orders, kept moving forward. But the idea of invulnerability died there. He brutally understood that no one was untouchable. That being a war veteran meant carrying names that would no longer be spoken at home, stories that would remain trapped in that distant territory. The nights were the worst. When his body finally stopped, his mind raced. Lucas relived scenes he didn't want to remember. They weren't graphic images, but sensations. The dull fear before leaving for a mission, the constant tension in his shoulders, the quick glances around, searching for signs that perhaps didn't exist. Sometimes, he would wake up with his heart racing, his body ready to react, even knowing he was in a relatively safe place. War didn't respect rest. As time passed, Lucas noticed changes in himself. He became more withdrawn, more economical with words. He laughed less. He observed more. He made decisions too quickly, even when it wasn't necessary. The war veteran in training was learning to shut off emotions to keep functioning. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. Feeling too much could mean hesitating. And hesitating in that context could cost lives. There was a specific moment, lost among so many others, that remained etched like an invisible scar. A seemingly simple mission. A scenario that should have been predictable. Something went wrong. Not in a cinematic way, but chaotically, confusingly, like almost everything in war. Lucas did what he was trained to do. He acted. He protected those who were by his side. He survived. And when it was all over, he realized that that ability to act without thinking had too high a price to pay later. The war officially ended for him months later. There were quick goodbyes, handshakes, promises to stay in touch. When Lucas boarded the plane back home, he felt an immediate relief, followed by a strange sense of emptiness, as if he had left something essential behind, or as if something had been ripped away and could no longer be recovered. At that moment, he didn't yet call himself a war veteran, but he already carried everything that signified. Back in the United States, the sounds were different, but still disturbing. Fireworks seemed too loud. Crowds made him uneasy. He noticed exits, assessed people, reacted to stimuli that others ignored. The marks of war weren't on his body, but they shaped every reaction, every thought. Lucas Harrington had returned alive, but not whole. Being a war veteran, he would later discover, wasn't just about having served. It was about learning to live with ghosts that didn't appear in photographs. It was about carrying a past that insisted on infiltrating the present. It was about trying to explain to himself why he had survived when others didn't have the same chance. And above all, it was about moving forward even when his mind remained trapped in places he would give anything to forget, but could never erase. In Red Willow Creek, Texas back then, the days used to drag on in a predictable, almost numbing way. For Lucas Harrington, as a war veteran, this predictability was both a refuge and a prison. Each morning seemed the same as the last. Each afternoon dissolved into silent attempts to continue existing without drawing attention. He believed, with the weary conviction of someone who had faced worse, that his life would continue like this indefinitely. Until, on a seemingly ordinary late afternoon, something broke that invisible line, separating the past from the present. The sky was heavy, dense clouds gathering on the horizon like a warning that few in the city took seriously. The wind blew stronger than usual, stirring up dust and making old signs creak. Lucas walked along the side street that led to an area further from the center, after another day without concrete answers about work. His thoughts were distant, caught up in simple calculations about how much longer he could afford the room above the workshop. He didn't immediately notice the strange sound cutting through the air. It was a scream, short, sharp, desperate. Lucas's body reacted before his mind had time to formulate questions. He stopped abruptly, his heart racing, his senses sharpening almost painfully. Being a war veteran meant recognizing certain sounds instantly, and this was no ordinary sound. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a joke, it was real fear. Lucas turned his face toward the source of the scream and, for a moment, hesitated. He had promised himself to keep his distance, not to get involved, not to draw attention, but promises made in comfort never hold up when reality demands action. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a metallic noise and the dry crack of something breaking. Lucas quickened his pace, feeling the familiar tension gripping his body. The street led to a small parking lot near an abandoned warehouse, a place that rarely saw any activity. As he approached, he noticed a scene that made his stomach clench. A car was parked illegally, its rear door open. Nearby, a young woman was trying to break free from a man who was pulling her forcefully, visibly agitated. Lucas didn't know either of them. And yet, something about that scene awakened in him a sense of urgency impossible to ignore. The war veteran within him quickly assessed the situation. Distance, environment, possible exits. There was no time to think about consequences, just act. He approached with firm steps, his voice low, controlled but full of authority. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He asked the man to step back. There was a moment of hesitation followed by a sudden movement. The man advanced, overcome by anger and surprise. Lucas reacted instinctively, using techniques he had learned years ago, not to hurt, but to restrain. Each movement was precise, economical. In seconds, the situation was under control. The young woman fell to her knees, trembling, trying to catch her breath. Lucas held the man immobilized until he heard distant sirens. Someone had called the police. When he finally released the attacker, he took a few steps back, his hands visible, his body still on edge. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The young woman stood up slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She thanked him, her voice faltering, trying to find words that wouldn't come. Lucas simply nodded. He wasn't there for recognition. He never had been. Before he could turn away completely, he heard hurried footsteps. An older man was approaching, visibly distressed, calling his daughter's name. The reunion was filled with emotion. The father hugged the young woman tightly, relief evident in every gesture. Only then did he notice Lucas, standing a few meters away. The way Lucas remained upright, attentive, even after the danger had passed, did not go unnoticed. There was something about him that didn't fit with an ordinary citizen. The police arrived shortly after. Questions were asked, statements were taken. Lucas answered only what was necessary. When questioned about how he had managed to act with such precision, he hesitated for a second before answering. "Training," he said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. The young woman's father heard that word and narrowed his eyes, as if beginning to connect the dots. When it was all over, the city looked different. The sky began to unleash the rain it had promised, and the people dispersed. Lucas walked away, his body still buzzing with adrenaline, his mind trying to comprehend what had just happened. He didn't know at that moment that this act had definitively broken his attempt to remain invisible. That, by acting as he always had, he had revealed something that could no longer be ignored. The war veteran who had tried to hide behind a simple life had been called back into action, and unknowingly, Lucas Harrington had just crossed a point of no return. Because that father, watching him disappear into the rain, would not forget that trained gaze. And because that simple gesture of humanity was about to change the course of their lives in ways neither of them could have foreseen. For most people, that downpour was just an inconvenience, something to be avoided. For Lucas Harrington, as a war veteran, the rain brought a strange kind of clarity. His body still vibrated with the recent adrenaline, his muscles tense, as if awaiting the continuation of a threat that had already been neutralized. Even so, he walked slowly, trying to lessen his own presence, as he had always done since returning from the war. Each step seemed to echo old memories. The smell of water mixed with dust transported him to other places, other times. Lucas took a deep breath, aware of the effort required to maintain control. The war veteran within him recognized this state. The moment after the action, when the mind begins to question what the body did by instinct. He knew he had acted correctly. Still, the weight of the decision was beginning to settle in, heavy and silent. Upon reaching the room above the workshop, Lucas didn't turn on the light immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed, letting the sound of the rain fill the space. The image of the young woman in danger kept returning. The fear in her eyes, the fragility exposed in seconds that seemed eternal. He closed his eyes and ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble. That scene could have ended differently. He knew that better than anyone. The war had taught him to calculate risks, but it had also shown him the cost of inaction. Being a war veteran meant carrying a responsibility that didn't disappear with military discharge. Lucas had learned on the battlefield that hesitating in the face of a threat put not only his own life at risk, but also the lives of others. There, in Red Willow Creek, he had tried to convince himself that that logic no longer applied, that the civilian world had its own rules. Still, when the moment came, he couldn't turn his face away. He He couldn't pretend he didn't see. The next day, the city seemed more awake than usual. Small groups chatted on the sidewalks. Whispers arose and spread. Lucas noticed more attentive glances than normal. They weren't hostile, but curious. He kept his head down, repeating his usual ritual. Cheap coffee, few words, no explanation. Still, something had changed. The invisibility he had cultivated with so much effort was beginning to crumble. As Lucas crossed the main street, he was interrupted by a firm voice. It was the man from the previous night, the young woman's father. A man of confident posture, simply dressed but well kept. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a direct gaze. He thanked Lucas again for what he had done. He spoke about his daughter, about the fright, about how everything could have ended in tragedy. Lucas listened in silence, uncomfortable with the attention. The man insisted on knowing more. He asked where that calmness under pressure came from, that precision in his movements. Lucas hesitated. For a moment, he thought of changing the subject. But there was something in that look, not judgment, but respect. He answered with restrained honesty. He said he had served, that he was a war veteran. He didn't mention where or for how long. He didn't need to. The effect was immediate. The man nodded slowly, as if that information explained everything. There was a heavy silence between them, followed by a subtle change in the father's posture. The respect was now explicit. He spoke about his own business, a local company facing difficulties. He said he needed someone trustworthy, someone who could handle pressure, someone with character. Lucas felt an immediate internal conflict. Part of him wanted to refuse. Accepting meant exposing himself, creating bonds, allowing someone to see beyond the surface. Another part, tired of surviving day after day, felt something close to hope. The war veteran within him remembered that courage wasn't limited to physical confrontations. Sometimes it took courage to accept help, to try again. He asked for time to think. The man respected that. Before parting, he placed a simple card in Lucas's hands and said that the offer wasn't out of debt, but out of gratitude. That echoed in Lucas's mind for the rest of the day. He walked to the river, sat on his usual bench, and watched the water flow. He thought about everything he had lost. He thought about everything he had avoided since returning from the war. Deep down, Lucas knew that saving that young woman wasn't just a reflex from training, it was a choice. A choice not to let the fear of his own past paralyze him. Being a war veteran didn't mean being condemned to eternal isolation. It meant, perhaps, carrying the capacity to protect, to act with humanity when others froze. As night fell over Red Willow Creek, Lucas made his decision. He didn't know if this new path would bring redemption or more challenges, but he knew that continuing to hide wouldn't protect him from the past. By choosing to take a step forward, he was doing something he hadn't done in a long time, choosing to live, not just survive. Accepting the offer meant much more than just starting a new job. For Lucas Harrington, as a war veteran, it was like crossing an invisible border he had avoided since returning to the country. In the first few days, everything seemed too simple to be real. Set schedules, clear tasks, straightforward expectations. Yet, beneath that apparent normalcy, a deep conflict was beginning to form, silent and persistent, growing within him like a constant pressure about to explode. The work environment wasn't hostile, but it wasn't neutral either. People were watching. They were evaluating. Lucas noticed the curious glances, the interrupted comments when he approached, the way some tried to be overly cordial while others kept their distance. In small towns like Red Willow Creek, Texas, stories spread quickly. The silent man who had saved a young woman had become a topic of conversation. And with that came expectations he had never asked to bear. Being a war veteran had always been something Lucas had kept hidden, not out of shame, but for emotional survival. Now, that identity was beginning to be projected onto him in ways that made him uncomfortable. Some treated him as a hero, others as someone broken, unpredictable. Neither label truly represented him. He was just a man trying to move on, but the world insisted on reducing him to something he couldn't explain in words. The greater conflict didn't just come from outside. Inside him, the war rekindled old dilemmas. The sound of metal tools falling to the ground made his body react automatically. Unexpected screams triggered internal alarms he thought he had controlled. At night, his dreams became more intense, as if his mind were responding to the new exposure. Lucas would wake up with his heart racing, his body stiff, struggling to remember where he was. There was also the constant fear of failure, not due to technical inability, but something deeper. He feared losing control. He feared that, at some point, the past would slip through the cracks of his current life. The war veteran who had survived the chaos feared he wouldn't be able to survive normalcy. Every small responsibility seemed to carry a disproportionate weight, as if a simple mistake could confirm all the fears he harbored about himself. The relationship with the young woman's father, now his employer, was respectful, but fraught with unspoken tension. There was gratitude, yes, but also expectation. Lucas felt that any slip-up would be interpreted not as a human error, but as a failure of someone who should know how to handle pressure. This kind of expectation was all too familiar. On the battlefield, there was no room for error. Here, theoretically, there was. But the war veteran within him couldn't fully accept that. As the weeks passed, the conflict intensified. A seemingly minor incident served as the trigger. An agitated customer began arguing, raising his voice and approaching aggressively. Before anyone could intervene, Lucas placed himself between the two, his posture rigid, his gaze firm, his voice too controlled for a situation that didn't require so much. The confrontation was quickly contained, but the silence that followed was heavy. People looked at Lucas differently at that moment. There was no applause, no thanks, just a palpable discomfort. He immediately realized what he had done. The war veteran had reacted before the average man. There was no violence, but the intensity was enough to remind everyone, and especially him, that something there didn't quite fit. That night, sitting alone in the room above the workshop, Lucas felt the weight of the conflict like never before. He questioned whether he truly belonged there, whether accepting the job had been a mistake, whether trying to reconnect with the civilian world was nothing more than a dangerous illusion. The war had given him clarity, harsh but clear rules. Life now seemed like a nebulous territory, full of gray areas where he didn't know exactly how to act. The biggest conflict wasn't external, it wasn't the job, it wasn't the city. It was the constant struggle between who he had been trained to be and who he needed to learn to be now. Being a war veteran meant having learned to survive in extreme conditions, but no one had taught him how to live after that. No one had given him a manual for dealing with human expectations, with tolerable mistakes, with emotions that could no longer be switched off. Lucas began to isolate himself again, even when surrounded by people. He spoke less, he avoided conversations. He performed his tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without involvement. The fear of hurting someone, emotionally or otherwise, became a constant shadow. He preferred distance to the possibility of repeating something he couldn't control. The conflict reached its peak when he realized something painful. Continuing that way meant losing everything again. His job, the trust he had recently gained, the chance to build something new. But change required confronting what he had been avoiding since returning from the war. It required looking directly at his own weaknesses, accepting that strength and vulnerability were not opposites. At that point, Lucas Harrington was cornered. Not by visible enemies, not by external threats, but by a past that demanded recognition. The war veteran had survived impossible scenarios. Now, he needed to decide if he would have enough courage to survive himself. The rupture didn't happen explosively. There were no shouts, sirens, or physical confrontations. For Lucas Harrington, a war veteran, the most painful moment of his entire life happened in silence, in the cruelest way possible, from within. It was on an ordinary night in Red Willow Creek, Texas, when the world seemed to be following its normal course while something essential was breaking apart within it. The day had been particularly difficult. Small mistakes had piled up like drops of water on a stone. A misinterpreted comment, a sideways glance. A conversation interrupted when he approached. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be pointed to as a direct accusation, but enough for Lucas to feel the familiar weight of inadequacy. The war veteran recognized that feeling. It was the same one that preceded impossible decisions on the battlefield. The difference was that there were no clear orders, only doubts. When the workday ended, Lucas politely declined the invitation for a casual chat. He said he was tired. It wasn't a lie, but the tiredness he felt wasn't physical, it was mental. He walked to his room above the workshop as the sky slowly darkened. The night wind carried the scent of distant rain, and each step seemed heavier than the last. Inside the room, the silence was absolute. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed and remained there for long minutes, staring at the floor. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't move. The walls seemed to close in around him. It was then that the memory surfaced, without warning. Not as a clear image, but as a sensation. The same pressure in his chest, the same helplessness, the same unanswered question. Why had he survived? The memories came in waves. The faces of comrades who didn't return, voices that echoed in his mind with painful clarity. Promises made in silence. Lucas brought his hands to his face, feeling his breath catch. The war veteran who had learned to endure physical pain was discovering once again that emotional pain followed no rules. It respected neither training, nor medals, nor years of effort to move forward. He stood up abruptly and began pacing the small space, his steps too fast. His heart raced. His body went into alert mode, as if he were back in a combat zone. But there were no enemies. There were no orders, only him and the past that refused to remain buried. Lucas felt his legs give way and leaned against the wall, his breathing short and irregular. That's where he broke down. Not in dramatic tears, but in a silent, profound collapse. A stifled sob. A suppressed groan. A war veteran finally allowing the pain to emerge unfiltered. He slid slowly to the floor, sitting with his back against the cold wall. His eyes fixed on nothing. His mind revisiting moments he had sworn never to face again. Lucas thought about the life he could have had. He thought about the young man full of convictions who believed that serving his country would give him meaning. He thought about the man who had returned, unable to recognize himself in the mirror. He thought about the constant effort to appear normal, functional, whole, and for the first time since returning from the war, he admitted something he had always avoided. He was tired of being strong. Being a war veteran meant for many resilience. For Lucas, at that moment, it meant exhaustion. Exhaustion from carrying expectations. Exhaustion from suppressing reactions. Exhaustion from pretending everything was under control. He felt the crushing weight of survivor's guilt, that cruel question that never finds an answer. Why him? Why not the others? Time passed without him noticing. When he finally managed to get up, his body felt strange, distant. Lucas walked to the small window and opened it. The cold air rushed in, bringing momentary relief. Outside, the city slept, lights off. No sign that the world was crumbling for someone in that small room. He seriously considered leaving, packing his bags, disappearing before he caused more discomfort, before anyone realized that the war veteran wasn't as stable as he seemed. The idea of running away was seductive. It always had been. The war had taught him to move quickly when necessary. But something kept him there, motionless, staring into the darkness. Perhaps it was the memory of the young woman's gaze that he had saved. Perhaps it was the opportunity that had arisen when he no longer expected anything. Or perhaps it was simply the painful realization that running away wouldn't erase what he carried. Lucas understood, in that moment of rupture, that continuing to avoid his own past was destroying any chance of a future. He closed the window and sat back down on the bed. He took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3 times. The war veteran wasn't defeated, but he was wounded in a different way. For the first time, Lucas Harrington faced the truth without armor. To move forward, he would have to confront what he had always avoided. Not with brute force, not with silence, but with emotional courage. That night marked the lowest point of his journey. The moment when everything almost completely collapsed. And, paradoxically, also the moment when something began to rebuild. Because upon hitting rock bottom, Lucas finally stopped fighting against himself. And that, even without him knowing it yet, would be the first step towards true overcoming. Dawn found Lucas Harrington. Lucas, a war veteran, sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes open for hours. The night had brought him no rest, but something different lingered in the air. It wasn't relief nor peace. It was a decision. After the silent collapse that had almost made him disappear, Lucas understood that continuing to exist would require more than resistance. It would require confrontation, not against external enemies, but against the fear he had learned to cultivate as a shield since the war. The day began with an unexpected call. The simple telephone on the table vibrated once. On the other end of the line, the young woman's father's voice, firm yet filled with worry, explained that there was a serious problem in the furthest warehouse, the same one near the area where everything had started weeks before. One employee had been injured, another had panicked, and the situation was rapidly escalating. There were no accusations, just a direct request. "I need someone who can keep calm." Lucas hung up without immediately responding. The war veteran within him assessed risks, memories, triggers. That place activated too many memories. Going back there meant facing the scene that had exposed him. It meant accepting that he could no longer hide. For a few seconds, the old urge to flee returned, but it was stifled by something stronger, the conviction that denying that call would be denying himself the chance to overcome. He arrived at the scene a few minutes later. The atmosphere was chaotic, but not violent. Tools were scattered, voices overlapped, tension hung in the air. One man was wounded, conscious, but in shock. Two others were arguing, each trying to take control without knowing how. Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. He walked firmly, quickly assessing the situation, as he had done hundreds of times in far more dangerous contexts. The war veteran assumed leadership naturally, but now there was something new. Conscious humanity. He asked for space. He organized simple tasks. He sent someone to call for medical help. He sat beside the wounded man, speaking softly, maintaining eye contact. He told him to breathe, explained each step of what he was doing. There was no unnecessary haste. There was no harshness. Just presence. Lucas felt his heart slow down as the situation stabilized. For the first time, he was using everything he had learned in the war without allowing the war to dictate his actions. When the ambulance arrived and the injured man was taken away, silence fell over the warehouse. People looked at Lucas differently, not with fear, not with exaggerated expectation, with trust. That difference, small and almost imperceptible, struck Lucas hard. He realized he didn't need to be a hero or a risk. He could be someone reliable, someone whole, even with scars. The young woman's father approached and thanked him, but Lucas interrupted him. For the first time, he spoke more than the bare minimum. He said he still struggled with things from the past, that sometimes he overreacted, that he wasn't perfect. The man listened in silence and replied with something simple yet definitive. "No one here expects perfection, only truth." That phrase pierced Lucas like few words had managed to since he became a war veteran. The real climax, however, didn't happen there. It happened hours later when Lucas returned to his room and found a letter on the table. It was from his mother, written years ago but never opened. He had carried it with him since returning from the war without the courage to read it. With hands trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. The words were simple. They spoke of pride, of love, of hope. They said he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That surviving was enough. Lucas felt his eyes welling up, but he didn't look away. "You read to the end." He cried without hiding it, not like a broken soldier, but like a man who finally allowed his pain to have a voice. There, in that small room in Red Willow Creek, he faced his greatest fear, accepting that being a war veteran didn't condemn him to eternal solitude, that there was room for rebuilding. The following morning, Lucas did something he had put off for years. He sought professional help. Not as a sign of weakness, but as an extension of the courage he had always possessed. He told his story little by little, without dramatizations, without heroics, just the truth. Each session was a difficult but necessary step. He began to sleep better, to react less, to breathe more consciously. Overcoming this wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't linear. There were relapses, difficult days, long silences, but something fundamental had changed. Lucas had stopped fighting against who he was. He had begun to integrate the war veteran and the civilian into a single possible identity. Not perfect, real. When he returned to work, he didn't return as someone trying to prove himself. He returned as someone who was present. And that made all the difference. He no longer needed to run from his past. He carried it with dignity, without allowing it to define his every step. In the final confrontation with his fears, Lucas Harrington didn't win by destroying anything. He won by remaining, by choosing to stay, by choosing to live. At that point in his journey, he understood something that war had never taught him. Courage isn't just about advancing under fire. Sometimes it's about stopping, looking inward, and deciding to keep going, even when everything inside you is telling you to give up. Time hasn't healed everything. Lucas Harrington, a war veteran, and perhaps he would never heal. But time, when it finally found space to act, began to rearrange the pieces that had remained scattered within him for years. In Red Willow Creek, Texas, the seasons continued to change as they always had. Summer gave way to a milder autumn, and the streets took on golden hues that seemed to soften even the most worn facades. For the city, nothing extraordinary was happening. For Lucas, everything was different. He continued waking up early, but now the awakening wasn't accompanied by the same tightness in his chest. There were still restless dreams, still difficult nights, but there were also mornings when he remained lying down for a few seconds, breathing, aware of where he was. Present. That in itself was already a silent victory. The war veteran who had previously lived in a constant state of alert was beginning to understand that safety didn't mean the absence of fear, but the ability to recognize it without being dominated by it. At work, Lucas ceased to be merely the man who saved that young woman. He became someone reliable, consistent, human. He made mistakes, learned from them, and adjusted. And when he erred, he didn't punish himself as before. Gradually, he began to talk more. Not about the war, not yet, but about simple things. The weather, work, life. Small bridges were built, without fanfare, without haste. He learned that belonging isn't achieved in a single heroic act, but through repeated choices to remain. The relationship with the young woman's father evolved into something Lucas had unexpected. Mutual respect without any burden. The silent expectation that he would always be the strongest in the room was gone. There was trust, yes, but also room for boundaries. And for the first time since returning from the war, Lucas felt he could exist without constantly having to justify himself. The war veteran no longer needed to be a constant explanation. He was simply part of who he was. On some late afternoons, Lucas would walk to the river, as he always had. But now he sat differently. His gaze wasn't fixed solely on the flowing water. He observed the sky, the trees, the slow movement of the city in the distance. Sometimes he thought about the past, about the friends who didn't return, about the versions of himself that were left behind. There was sadness, yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a respectful longing, an acknowledgement of all that had been lived. Lucas also began to speak, little by little, in therapy sessions first, then in occasional conversations. He discovered that telling his story didn't make it more powerful about him. On the contrary, it gave it shape. It gave it meaning. Being a war veteran ceased to be an undefined burden and became a nameable part of his journey. He wasn't just what he had lost. He was also what he had survived. There was one particular day, months later, when Lucas realized the true extent of the change. He was helping a new employee, a younger man, visibly insecure, who had made a simple mistake and was on the verge of panic. Lucas recognized that look, that fear of failure. Instead of correcting him curtly, he sat beside him and calmly explained. He said something he would never have been able to say to himself years before. Making mistakes doesn't erase who you are. At that moment, Lucas understood that the war had left him not only with scars, it had also given him a rare ability to understand the fear of others, to offer firmness without harshness, presence without imposition. The war veteran had finally found a purpose that was not linked to destruction, but to reconstruction. Red Willow Creek remained a small, imperfect, limited town. But now it was also a possible place. A place where Lucas could put down roots without feeling like he was betraying who he had been. He didn't need to forget the war to move on. He needed to integrate it, and that he was learning day by day. In the final scene of this silent journey, Lucas walks down the main street at dusk. The sun sets behind the hills, and golden light spreads across the asphalt. He stops for a moment, observes the city, takes a deep breath. There is no epic music, no applause, just a man standing, whole in his own way. Lucas Harrington is a war veteran. He always will be. But now he's also something more. A man who has learned that surviving is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Because true courage lies not only in facing the external enemy, but in choosing every day to live despite the scars. And sometimes a war veteran's greatest victory isn't returning home. It's about learning that, even after everything, it's still possible to call a place and yourself home. Before I wrap up, let me tell you something simply. If you've stayed this far, it's because this story spoke to you on some level. Whether through the pain, the overcoming, or the silence that exists between one scene and another. And it's exactly this type of narrative that I want to continue bringing you here. If this content provided you with value, made you reflect, or offered you a different perspective, consider subscribing to the channel. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a way to continue receiving stories that respect the time, emotions, and intelligence of the viewers. And if you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." I'll know that you made it to the end and that this journey had meaning for you. Likes also help, not as a number, but as a sign that the connection we created throughout the video actually happened. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this subject. Click on it and continue watching it. See you next time.